Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Axe. I used to work in the library a lot, now I'm in the front office a lot. You see me in the office every day. So tonight, I'm your mystery reader. I am going to start on chapter 5, which is on page 25. So I'll be reading chapter 5 and 6 of our book, The Stupendously Spectacular Spelling Bee. So please turn to page 25 and read along. Thanks. Chapter 5. Perspicacious. Perceptive, smart, canny. He had a perspicacious plan he hoped would work. That's a big word. Okay, let's go. Dad had a plan, a perspicacious one. Even though he'd have to think hard about how to spell it, he had no doubt that it was perspicacious. The next Saturday, while Boo and Mom were at a doctor appointment and Nana Flo was at her judo class, Dad asked India to help him with a job. The roof in town hall needs fixing, and I said I'd take a look. How'd you like to come along? India held a spoonful of cereal in the air. Will we make it back before Boo and Mom come home? India always liked to be there when Boo got back from the doctor to know what she'd said. Sure. India thought there was something sneaky about his answer. Really? Yep. Dad grabbed the spoon from her hand and dropped it in the bowl with sudden urgency. Let's go. They drove to the hall in Dad's battered van. On the doors of his van, he'd painted a sign that read, Arnie the Fixer. You bust it, I fix it. Dad talked steadily all the way there about the weather, his work, and a low-flying pigeon he suddenly found fascinating. In fact, he spoke almost nonstop, which was something he only did when he was nervous or excited. Are you okay, Dad? Okay, of course I'm okay. Never felt better. He kept talking all the way to the hall and right up to the front doors, but when he flung them open, India's nerves were instantly on high alert. Inside, she saw rows of chairs filled with people. What's going on? She asked. Dad hoisted his work bag over his shoulder. A few of the gang said they'd help me out. He took a step forward, but India tugged his sleeve. All these people are going to help you fix the roof? Not the roof exactly. There's another problem I need help with. He winked. Come on. But Dad didn't hear because he was already whistling his way to the front of the hall. India wanted to sneak back into the van before anyone noticed her, which, unfortunately, was when Dad's best friend Daryl did just that. India's here! Daryl jumped up from his seat and waddled over, pulling on the hood of what was, India blinked to make sure she was seeing right, a onesie cow costume. He threw out his arms. How do I look? Like a cow? India frowned. The rest of the crowd was pulling on hoods too, and it was only then that India noticed they were all dressed in costumes. There were chickens, pandas, frogs, even a peacock. What's going on, Daryl? I had a conversation with your dad about how smart you are at spelling, which is true, Dad called before he ducked behind the stage curtain. And we wanted to let you know that Youngabilla is right behind you. Daryl had a big booming voice which he always used, including now when India wished he wouldn't. Thank you, she kept her voice low, hoping he'd take the hint. But the problem isn't my spelling, it's my nerves, he boomed. We know, your dad told us. That's why we thought we'd try another practice session. Another practice? India felt faint. We tried that at home but you didn't have us. This time, when you get nervous, just look up and see how ridiculous we look. It will take your mind off your nerves. The crowd of fluffy humans nodded. We're here for you, India. A large parrot, who looked like Mrs. O'Donnell from the bakery, flapped her wings. India waved back and whispered to Daryl, Thank you. That's very nice of you, but Don't thank us yet. There's more. Daryl pointed his hoof toward the stage. Take it away, Arnie. The stupendously spectacular Spelling Bee theme music blasted from the hall speakers. The curtains flew aside, and on stage, beneath a giant hand-painted banner that read Spelling Bee, were Mom, Nana Flo, and Ernie sitting at a large desk. Boo stood at the podium in an oversized sparkly blue suit. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone with the flair of a circus ringmaster, "I'd like to introduce to you Youngabilla's candidate for the stupendously spectacular spelling bee, India Whimple." The audience cheered, squawked, and mooed. India's skin tingled even more, and she wondered why the room suddenly started to spin. Darryl held out his arm. "Ready for your big moment?" India desperately wanted to say no and run from the hall, but Darryl hooked his hoof around her arm, and before she could move, he led her past the furry crowd and onto the stage beside Dad, who was now dressed in a crocodile costume. Everyone quieted down. "India Whimple," Darryl boomed, "we in this hall would like to make a few declarations to one of our favorite families in Youngabilla and one of my favorite little girls." India could feel her face turn a fiery red. Darryl pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held one hoof on his heart. The audience did the same with their paws, flippers, and wings. Darryl began. "We declare we will support you in your attempt to be the next stupendously spectacular spelling bee champion." "We do," the audience cried, "because we think you're brilliant. It's true. And we will happily wear these costumes for as long as it takes to do it." "We will." "This is our declaration to you here today. Hear, hear." "What do you say?" Dad asked, hope all over his face. "Want to give it another try?" An expectant hush fell over the hall. India recognized even more faces. There was old Joe Miller the butcher, Gracie Hubbard from the cafe, the kids from school, all staring at her with looks of anticipation. India hadn't stood in front of so many people since that day when she froze on stage. She shivered at the thought of it, but despite what she knew she should do, India found herself nodding. "Okay." "That's my girl!" Dad shouted. "Let the spelling bee begin." Cries and hoots erupted as Dad gave India one last hug before he and Darryl left the stage and took their seats in the front row. India scowled at her brother. "I thought you were at the doctor's." Boo shrugged. "We lied, but it was for a very good cause." India looked back at the audience settling into their seats, waiting to hear her spell. She felt a wave of sickness and whispered, "I don't think I can do it." Boo smiled at his sister. "India, you know you're my favorite person in the world. And I mean this in the nicest way possible. But you're wrong. You're amazing, and we want the world to know it." "You bet your sweet patootie," Nana Flo said, even though India wasn't sure what a patootie was. "And remember," Mom said, wearing an exaggerated grin, "a smile will make you feel better." India tried, but her face looked more like she just stubbed her toe. She would definitely need more practice to get it right. The crowd fell into an eager silence. "India," Boo said, "your first word is embarrassed. This is an adjective meaning to be self-conscious or shy." At that moment, Darryl stood up in his cowsuit. "If I were to use it in a sentence," Boo continued, "I could say Darryl was embarrassed when he tripped in front of his friends." Darryl strolled in front of the audience, swinging his tail until he fell in a spectacular hoof-waving tumble. The audience laughed. India smiled briefly before trying to focus on the word. "Embarrassed," she began. E-M-B. She seemed to lose track and began writing on her hand. E-M-B. She paused, and then she looked up at the costumed audience. India was surprised. It did make her feel better. She began again with a little more confidence. E-M-B-A-R-R-A-S-S-E-D. Embarrassed. "That is correct!" Boo cried. Nana Flo rang a cowbell with gusto and shouted, "Yee-haw!" The audience went wild, but this time they pulled posters from underneath their seats that read, "You can do it, India," and "Go, India!" See? There was even a sign that said, India for Prime Minister. Your next word, Boo said, suddenly serious, is songstress. This is a noun meaning a female singer. A woman in a koala suit stood up. India couldn't be certain, but she thought it looked a lot like her teacher. Mrs. Wilde, she asked. Hello, dear, she waved her paw. When your dad asked if we could help you get over your jitters, we were happy to. Weren't we? She turned to the costumed crowd around her, which India now realized were kids from her class. You can do it, India! Boo continued. If I used it in a sentence, I could say, Mrs. Wilde is a wonderful teacher, but sadly, she's a terrible songstress. Mrs. Wilde burst into a high-pitched operatic squeal. The audience plugged their ears and groaned. Some even fell on the floor. India giggled. Songstress. S-O-N-G-S-T-R-E-S-S. Songstress. That is correct, Boo declared. Nana Flo rang the cowbell. I knew you'd nail it. Boo read out more words. Audience members sprang from their seats to help act out each one. There was Hector the policeman, Lois and Edna the grocery store owners, and Ahmed the bus driver, all here just for her. Gradually, India began to feel more at ease, almost as if she were in her living room on a Friday night. The words became harder, but India didn't flinch right up until Boo's very last word. Aficionado, he said carefully. This is a noun meaning a person who is very knowledgeable about an activity or subject. India was a spelling bee aficionado. India looked straight into the audience, each one of their hooded faces willing her to get it right. Aficionado. A-F-I-C-I-O-N-A-D-O. Aficionado. Correctamundo! Nana Flo rang her cowbell in one continuous clang, 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 clang. Ladies and gentlemen, Boo announced, India has spelled 50 words without one mistake. The crowd sprang to their feet, cheering and hugging each other in a wild animal rumpus. Dad scrambled onto the stage, his tail flopping behind him, and knelt before India. So what do you think? Would you like to give the competition a try? Do you really think I can do it? I know you can do it, said Dad. We all do. You just have to convince yourself. A town hall filled with friends and family was one thing, but could she be on stage in front of an audience of strangers with cameras broadcasting her face into the living rooms of millions of people? Even thinking about it made her dizzy. Will you, India? Daryl asked, straightening his cow horns that drooped a little to the side. Anytime you get nervous, just think of us. A gathering of birds, frogs, and bears stood beside Daryl and nodded their costumed heads. India had known most of them all her life. Each one was there just for her, waiting for her decision. Even though being in front of a crowd normally made her feel queasy and scared, India realized she didn't feel completely terrified, and that's why she answered, okay. This time there was no stopping them. Everyone in the hall was dancing and throwing their wings and paws in the air. Nana Flo and Mom joined in the hugging, while Boo simply smiled at his sister. See, he asked, you're amazing, just like I said. For the first time since that Friday night in front of the TV, India thought she might, just might, have a chance of being the next stupendously spectacular spelling bee champion. And that's the end of chapter 5. Now we're going to move on to chapter 6. You should be on page 36. The word is trepidation. It's a noun meaning fear, apprehension, the heebie-jeebies. She lay awake most of the night, full of trepidation. And let's get started. Dad's plan had worked. After facing the audience of friends in their finest costumes, India's nerves had settled down and preparations for the spelling bee began in earnest. The Wimple family helped her practice, just as Dad had promised. The first round was only a few weeks away, and he drew up a plan, so every spare second was devoted to spelling. They practiced over dinner and breakfast and on the way to school, and Mrs. Wilde made sure to have extra spelling games in class every day. India's favorite way to practice was bouncing on the trampoline while Boo sat in a chair, calling out words. With each jump, she had to say another letter without missing a bounce. She also loved when they'd lie on the picnic blanket in the backyard, and Mom would tell them stories, stopping at unexpected moments for India to spell the last word she'd said. Her favorite story was one Mom made up called Brave Boo and Ingenious India, about two courageous children who fought villainous baddies and ravenous monsters. Mom would throw in as many difficult words as she could, and India would spell them all perfectly. While she was at school, Nana Flo, Boo, and Mom would stick words on the fridge, along the hall, on her bedroom ceiling, even on the back of the bathroom door, so that the whole house was wallpapered with words. The next morning, Nana Flo, who was an early riser, would sneak into India's room, lean in only inches away from her granddaughter's face, and wait for her to wake up. When India woke to see Nana's giant eyes staring down at her, she'd squeal. "Morning, sunshine," Nana Flo would say. "Ready to spell?" It was something India was never quite used to. At night, Mom, Dad, and Boo would practice with her until none of them could hold in their yawns any longer. They'd say goodnight, and Dad would switch on the night light in the hall, which sent a faint beam linking Boo's room with India's. "Night, Boo," India whispered. "Night, India," Boo whispered right back. India would slip under the blankets, sneak her flashlight from her bedside drawer, and flick through the dictionary to choose the hardest word she could find. Pertinacious, tenacious, temerarious. When Dad crept in to check on India, he often found her asleep, head resting on the dictionary, the creased pages making lines on her cheek. Dad would carefully slip the book out from under her head and settle her back on her pillow. There she is, sleeping with the dictionary under her head. Roused from sleep, she'd groan and mumble more words. Camouflage, fluorescent, slumberous. "That's right, sweetheart. Now it's time to sleep." When she'd heard Dad's voice and felt his kiss on her head, she finally fell into a deep, wordless slumber. But the night before the first round of the spelling bee was different. The house had long settled into sleep, but even Dad's voice hadn't worked, and India was still awake. She stared at the luminous green numbers on her alarm clock. 3:23. She worried about being with the other kids, about whether she would freeze in the crowd, if she'd even be able to spell her own name. What if she just wasn't good enough? 3:45. She tried to make herself drift off quietly reciting words, but every time she promised herself it would be the last one, her brain jumped to another. Punctilious, perseverant, and persistent. 4:15. Fatigued, weary, exhausted, until a small, muffled cough drifted across the hall, and India was instantly awake. She leaped from her bed and into Boo's room. She found him slumped forward and short of breath. His shoulders rose and fell in waves, and he was gasping for breath. India grabbed his blue inhaler, and gave it a shake before popping on the spacer. "Sorry," Boo said between strangled breaths, "for waking you." "Don't be silly," India handed him the inhaler. "I couldn't sleep. At least this way I get to be useful." By now everyone was up, disheveled and rumpled, but fully awake, just as they always were when Boo needed them at night. When Boo had a flare-up, it usually started with a quiet whistling. Each time he took a breath, it sounded as if someone were sitting on his chest, crushing all of the air out of him, making it hard to breathe. Then came the coughing. Mom sat by Boo's side. India pressed another puff of medication into the spacer, and the Wimples silently counted each of his 4 breaths. "That's it, honey," Mom said. You'll feel better any minute now." She was an expert at sounding calm when Boo had a flare-up. Dad stood behind them, silent and still. He wasn't as good as Mom at hiding how scared he was. Nana Flo linked her arm through Dad's. "Your mom's right," she said. "You'll be good as new in no time." Everyone knew she said it more for Dad than Boo. Last year had been especially bad for Boo, and this was the main reason Mom had left her job, so she could be near him during the day. In case. She never said in case of what, and the rest of the Wimples were happy that she never did. Mom gently stroked his back using her same calm voice. Nice, steady breaths. They could never tell what would trigger a flare-up. It could be running, laughing, smoke, or dust. Sometimes it seemed to be nothing at all. What the Wimple family did know was that these were the scariest times of their lives. Slowly, Boo was able to fill his lungs, and the feeling in his chest being squished finally eased. I'm okay now. And just like that, every uptight shoulder in the Wimple family relaxed. We knew you'd be fine, Dad said, even though he hadn't believed it until right then. He gave Boo one of his dad hugs, one that lasted a little longer than usual, and tucked him in. Would you like me to stay? I'll stay, India said, just until Boo falls asleep. India often did this after a flare-up. She did it to make sure Boo really was okay, but Dad also knew it was to send away the worried thoughts in her head that would grow bigger if she went to bed right away. Okay, Dad said, but not for long. We've got a spelling bee to get to. Boo held up his blanket and India climbed in beside him. Are you sure you feel okay? She asked. Much better. His voice was scratchy. Tell me a story. Which one? India didn't really need to ask. She knew exactly what he'd say. The story of when I was born, he whispered. Okay. They nestled in closer and India began. When Mom told me she was having a baby, I screamed and danced around the kitchen for 5 whole minutes. But when she said we'd have to wait 6 months, I sat down on the floor and cried. We counted down, marking off every day on the calendar, but it still felt as if you'd never get here. Then you came 6 weeks early. It happened so fast, Mom thought you'd be born in the back of Dad's car. Nana Flo said you were in a hurry because you couldn't wait to meet us. Then what happened? He knew the answer, but he asked anyway. The doctors told us your lungs were too small and that you might not make it. Nana Flo said, Fiddlesticks! He's a Wimple, and we Wimples never give up. He's going to be just fine. The doctor showed us into the nursery. You were in a plastic crib, crying and covered in all these wires and tubes that were attached to a machine that groaned and hissed beside you. The nurses said you weren't strong enough to breathe on your own, so the machine was doing it for you. What did I look like? You were wrinkly and purple. But when we were finally allowed to see you, you stopped crying, as if you'd been crying out for us. And when I reached through the small round window to touch you, you grabbed my finger. The doctor said you were weak, but you squeezed my finger so hard it was sore for days. That's not true. It is, and I had the bruises to prove it. I knew then that no matter what the doctor said, you weren't going anywhere. Except to bed. Dad poked his head in around the door. Because I need to make sure my champion spelling team has enough sleep. India slipped out of bed and carefully fixed the blankets beneath Boo's chin. Night, Boo, she whispered. Night, India, Boo whispered right back. India crossed the hall to her room, leaving her door open as she always did to let the glow from the nightlight connect Boo's room to hers. And that is the end of chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed these last 2 chapters we just read and that you're enjoying the book overall. Good night, boys and girls.